Let's bring our guest, Vinoo Varghese, white-collar federal criminal defense and former prosecutor. Vinoo, welcome to Breitbart News Tonight. It's good to have you on. It's under unfortunate circumstances right now because the city of Louisville, Kentucky, is beginning to look like a state of lawless despair, and it's because it's in reaction to, anyway, I should say, Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron today held a special press conference, and he detailed with great specificity that and announced that no police officers would be charged directly for the death of Breonna Taylor. Break down sort of the highlights, Vinoo, if you will, of the grand jury decision in everything that Attorney General Cameron laid out today.
Well, I can tell you this was a tough one, and to the extent that something good came out of this is hopefully a greater awareness of the problems with the war on drugs. And I think here it seems like they went to great pains to explain things and understand that an innocent woman died during this raid. It seems, and again, remember, a grand jury is just there to see if there's enough evidence to move forward, right? That's all a grand jury is there for. So when people say they've been indicted, and this is the biggest nonsense that prosecutors all across this country use, right? Which is, a grand jury indicted them, right? And it doesn't mean anything because a grand jury is not an adversarial proceeding. There is no judge. There is no defense lawyer being able to object. So the fact that they moved forward in this really doesn't say much as to the strength of the case against the individual officer they charged. It just means that there was minimal evidence needed to move forward. The fact that nobody was charged with murder speaks volumes, okay? That actually speaks, it's big, because from their point of view, they didn't have anything, even a scintilla of evidence to charge any sort of murder, meaning intentional homicide. So, there's a lot to digest here. The highlights of this is that, yes, and a woman who was innocent was killed. She shouldn't have been killed. But this is a larger question if you want to get into it. And I'm happy to get into it about the problems with the war on drugs. And I think that this is the situation. I think the Attorney General said that this was not a no-knock warrant. But, her boyfriend fired first. So, in the whole scheme of things, there was no homicide. It seemed like they charged one officer with wanton or some kind of recklessness, wanton engagement in the first degree for blindly firing through a door and a window in Taylor's building. But according to Cameron, evidence showed officers knocked and announced their presence at the apartment.
Yeah.
The big deal that you want to take away from this is, in all these cases that have cost them national headlines, right? With a person of color, in this case, in all of them, right? Rayshard Brooks, George Floyd, the case in Kenosha. All of these involve, all these are cases which are more than meets the eye. So unless you've been involved in law enforcement and understand what's going on, these are easy to jump to conclusions. And in this case, people shouldn't jump to conclusions.
We're being joined right now by Vinoo Varghese. He is a white-collar federal criminal defense and former prosecutor. I think you sort of hit the nail on the head, Vinoo. Early on, the reports, at least from the local affiliates, were that there was a witness, and it's the same witness that apparently spoke to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who also helped state investigators in investigating this story, and that the witness said that the officers announced themselves, and that in Kenneth Walker, whose apartment that it belonged to, he also testified or told the police that they'd announced themselves. The officer Brett Hankinson, who was charged with wanton endangerment, he was fired almost immediately. He is the officer who fired into neighboring apartments. The two other officers involved, that is Sergeant Jonathan Mattingly and Detective Miles Cosgrove, they were not charged. And that, I believe, Vinoo, is sort of the crux of the catalyst for why there right now are hundreds or maybe even thousands of people protesting. We've already seen property damage. There are right now, just breaking on Breitbart News, reports that at least one officer has been shot in Louisville. There's no information immediately right now about the officer's wounds. There could be more than one, but at least one officer has been shot. But I think you hit the nail on the head. The local media, I think, and certainly we followed this story. We're talking about 6 months at Breitbart News, and we were dutifully trying to get all of the information pertaining to this case. And it seemed like most of the media just ignored it, and people sort of glommed onto that Breonna Taylor was fatally shot in the middle of the night in police conducting, and executing a warrant, and it just had all of the makings, all of the trappings that it sort of fit neatly, as you sort of alluded to, into police yet again shooting an unarmed black person. And there were so many details, there were so many holes in the story that it just seemed like, for political reasons, a lot of people just shoved fallacy and falsehoods into those holes.
I have to say that in all of these cases, and I've written two op-eds, one about George Floyd that was published in the New York Law Journal and law.com, that spoke about the fact that the initial video tape, or the what you saw from some of the people on the street, didn't tell the whole story. And as more and more evidence came out, it showed that the guy was high on fentanyl, and there were potential other things that were at play here that mitigated against a charge of murder, or intentional murder at least. Mm-hmm. In that sense, I said that it's a manslaughter charge for Derek Chauvin was probably it was a viable charge, but certainly not any sort of intentional murder or reckless murder. Then I wrote an op-ed that was published in the New York Daily News about Rayshard Brooks, the individual shot in Atlanta. In my view, that was a clean shoot. He had beaten, the officers were good to him, they were nice, they tried to put him to rest, he fought with him, he stole their taser, talked, and then he ran, and he pointed the taser and the cop shot him. That, in both of these cases, you have political prosecution. So I actually credit the Kentucky law enforcement officials for not jumping the gun and not announcing an immediate arrest or firing officers immediately the way they did in Atlanta and in Minneapolis. And I think that here, I'm not sure, and again, the fact that they brought charges against this one officer, Brent Hankinson, for wanted endangerment, doesn't mean that he's going to be found guilty.
Right.
The larger issue goes, and this is something that's not political, right? This is the larger issue is something that Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals, libertarians can all and should agree on, which is, why are there search warrants executed in this country over drugs? And, too many times throughout, history, throughout this country, You have people who have their houses broken into, police knocking down, breaking down cars, causing and holding people and kids at gunpoint. And far too often, they have wrong intel. And they've disrupted people's lives, and people are put, most of the time, there isn't a shooting. So this was kind of an unusual and an unfortunate case where somebody in the home had a firearm and actually shot one of the police officers
in the arm.
So that heightened the situation, right?
Yeah.
That changed the whole dynamic of this, because if that didn't happen, these guys usually do not come in shooting, right? They come in breaking things down and they have their guns out, but often they don't come in shooting. So, the fact that there was gunfire exchange is what ultimately led to her death. And the calls for, and I've heard all of this, and unless you're involved in law enforcement, I mean, listen, I worked as a prosecutor for 6 years, and I looked at my time there, and that was a long time ago. That was almost 20 years ago. And I looked at my time there, and it's a very different culture now, right? People understand that the war on drugs, I shouldn't say everybody, right? But enough people understand that there's something wrong here. So Breonna Taylor would be alive today but for this war on drugs. And so that's the larger issue here. This isn't about race. This isn't about police oversight, except, let me correct myself. This is about over-policing. And if we as a society can accept that, hey, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't militarize the police. Maybe we shouldn't militarize the war on drugs. Then maybe there'll be less of these incidents. And I think that's the larger issue here.
Attorney General Cameron, he spoke for over 30 minutes, Vinoo, but he didn't really get into the deep and granular details of the larger and broader investigation. I mean, and forgive me, if I missed it, but there were questions about, trap houses, the sort of vernacular term used for homes in which dealers know that the drugs are there, they go pick them up, they exchange the money. There were at least a half dozen of these homes, and so there was a broader investigation. The warrant that was being served at Walker's home that night, those officers apparently weren't tied to that investigation. I don't know. I have to assume, right, that Attorney General Daniel Cameron didn't get into the details surrounding, again, the broader investigation, why the warrant was served, and why the investigators were surveilling Walker's apartment. I have to assume that he didn't really get into those details because maybe that investigation is still ongoing. It certainly leaves more questions than answers, particularly for someone like me who's been following this case for 6 months. And then you have the grand jury that convenes on this Monday, and it takes them 2 days to come to this decision in which they do, they decide to bring charges against one officer, but it's his charges aren't even involved in the shooting because they found, as you said, that the shooting of Breonna Taylor was lawful because in Kentucky law says that if officers are fired upon, and which Walker did, shooting one officer in the arm, then it is not unlawful for those officers to shoot back. It just seems like, this is just a wild and bizarre case. As you said, Breonna Taylor is dead, but those officers weren't there by accident, and there was drug activity in the neighborhood, and an investigation was happening. It just seems like we, at least right now, I'm not going to say we may never know, but right now we certainly have more questions than answers as it relates to that.
I would agree with you that there are more questions than answers. Whether there probably was drug activity in the neighborhood, no doubt. Whether there was drug activity at that house, that is unknown. Mm-hmm. I can tell you that I've seen cases where the officers, the search warrant has laid out the wrong apartment, the wrong house. I mean, in New York City, this is common. I don't know, Kentucky. Obviously, I've been to Louisville, but I don't know the specifics of the place. So it's certainly anything is possible. But I can tell you this, and again, this speaks to the larger question, and I think we can all agree, and particularly if you are someone who's skeptical of the government, you've got to ask yourself, why is this, what was, the probable cause to knock this place down? Because I've seen too many cases where there have just been errors. I mean, I had a case where a individual came to me, and this was in Harlem, and he had a decent amount of cash in his apartment, right? He's a black guy. He had $40,000 of cash. There was a search warrant executed on his apartment. Now, you may be asking, why would a guy carry $40,000 in cash on himself? Well, there's a whole segment of the population that doesn't trust banks. Doesn't mean he's a criminal. And he had accumulated that. There was no tax issues involved, and there was an allegation that there were drugs being sold out of the apartment, except that upon further review of the warrant, there was no description, there was no particularity. They got the wrong apartment, and they just found no drugs in the apartment, but they found the cash. And so the NYPD seized the cash and realized that under state law they stood no grounds, and the DA was going to return this money immediately. So what did they do? They turned this over to Homeland Security. And what I'm saying to you is, this is the greater sin, right? The interplay between the state and federal government to try to steal people's money. And so they turned this over to the Homeland Security, and they seized it under federal forfeiture laws. Look, fortunately for this guy, he came to me, and I knew the laws, and I basically told the attorney, the federal attorney, and I said to her, listen, you've got nothing on this guy. You've got the wrong place. I mean, is it a crime? Tell me, where in the United States Code is it a crime to charge people with having money in their apartment? I mean, she was like, blah, 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 couldn't say anything, right? So I said, look, here's the deal. You either return his money, or I go on television and name you personally, right? And name your bosses, and give, because normally in these cases, the way it's a racket, right? The people that are smart enough to hire lawyers will get, they'll have to give up some percentage. In this situation, I told her, I was like, listen, don't even think about that. You're going to return every single dollar and cent. And she did, right? Yeah. But that's because this guy was smart enough to hire the right lawyer. The larger issue, of course, and this is the thing that I think you guys, at Breitbart and institutions like yourself can really challenge is, and this is a non-partisan issue, is why is this still going on, right? We've gone beyond this, right? Breonna Taylor shouldn't be dead, right? And this is unfortunate. Are the officers guilty of any criminality? I don't believe they are. I'm skeptical of the one officer who was charged, and I think that'll play itself out over time. Yeah. But the issue is that too far, at least in Kentucky, it seems there was at least some deliberative process, unlike in Atlanta and unlike in Minneapolis. Yeah. So maybe there's some positive stuff that'll come out of this.
Vinoo, thank you for joining the program. Really, really helpful discussion and breakdown of the details. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.